Hey everyone, this is part 2 of the conversation with James Douma. In it, we discuss about how the vehicle makes the decisions on the road. So just imagine if you are the self-driving vehicle or if you're the Tesla driving down the road, how are you perceiving the world? How are you making your decisions? These are the questions that we're going to ask and hopefully we get the answers to. So again, if you like the content that is coming on this channel, please do remember to like and subscribe. It really keeps us going and hopefully we can invite more interesting people to come aboard to share all their interests with us. All right, awesome. Enjoy. Yeah, so there's one thing that I'm kind of curious, right? What happens when you're in different driving environments? So if you kind of remember, there was one portion in the video where the driving we did with Deborah, right? And then there was a bus ahead of us that was pulled over, and the vehicle stopped. So the car actually took the left lane, right? And it straddled both lanes. It caused the vehicle behind to slow down a bit. And I was like, oh, wow, that was a nice move. It's a really confident move by the Tesla. But on Deborah's side, I was like, oh, that was bad, right? Like, so in such situations, it comes down to driving environments, right? So for us, because you're driving in really heavy city traffic and you don't have much clearance to do anything. So that's fine, like where I'm coming from. But so how in future, how would Tesla do something like that? Like you take the same full self-driving that's happening in one country, and then you put it in a different country, and then you have totally different behaviors and environments to work with. How would they solve such a problem?
So there are kind of two different approaches that you can take, and the one approach is that you allow the neural network to be tuned to different environments so that it has slightly different behaviors, and this is kind of what people do. You know, if you've driven, I don't know if you've driven in two different cities where people just behave differently. And in one town, you have to be kind of aggressive. And in the other town, everybody's like waiting for everybody else to go.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, as a human, you kind of learn the environment and you change your driving style to adapt. I spend a lot of time in the San Francisco Bay Area and a lot of times in Los Angeles. And people are totally different the way they drive. Like if you have to drive kind of like a jerk in LA or you don't get anywhere. But if you do that in San Francisco, people honk at you and they get upset, right? So you have to change. So one thing you can do is you can let the car do that also. You can let it have slightly different behaviors. Another thing that you can do is you can just, one thing that neural networks are actually pretty good at is having a detailed understanding of a lot more stuff simultaneously than a human can do. So there are a lot of ways that neural networks are terrible compared to people in the things that they can do right now. But there are also some ways that they're just amazing. And one of the ways that they're pretty amazing is that they can have lots of different, you know, specific behaviors simultaneously for like thousands of different situations and just switch between them accordingly. So that will come down to a trade-off. In the early days, like when Tesla first releases a version of FSD to Singapore, they will probably release a version that is trained and tested and that's specific to Singapore. Like Singapore gets it, and it'll be different from the US and different from Australia and so on, right? In time, they will be able to do single systems that can drive anywhere, and that'll be simpler and kind of more powerful also. So one of the things that we see with neural networks is that when a new capability is delivered, often it's a small specialized network that is especially good at it. And over time, what you find is that the systems that end up being the best in the long run are often very big systems that aren't even trained on that problem. They're trained on something else. So like the really big language models today, they're good at like question answering. You know, they can do question answering, they can do chat bots, they can do grammar analysis they can do all kinds of stuff. But they're only trained to predict the next word in the sentence, right? I mean, they're trained on a very, very simple problem, but they're trained on an enormous amount of data, and they're very, very big networks. So one of the things, the natural sort of development cycle of a new technology in neural networks is typically that in the beginning you make specialized systems, and then over time you make very powerful, very general systems that are actually very good at all these different things. And that's probably what we'll see with FSD also. Initially, you'll see a version that's just for your country or just for your city, and then later the system will become so good in so many places that they don't need to make different systems. I don't know if you know this. I know you came to the U.S. for this. I don't know if you've been here before. But if you travel around the U.S., different states, the traffic laws are different in all 50 states in the U.S., right? And so the ways they make the roads are different, and the ways people drive are different. So the U.S. is actually a very challenging place to make FSD work because there are so many different roads. In fact, Austin has a lot of the road construction in Austin is kind of unique in that it has some features that don't occur in other cities. And FSD is terrible with those because it's never seen them before, right? It doesn't see them in Kansas or California or Washington. You only see those things in Austin. And because it doesn't get a lot of experience with them, it's much less good with those features. And so one of the interesting things about driving around Los Angeles, right, as when you're showing FSD to somebody is if you just go to some random neighborhood, like what a person might think is hard, and you drive around, it works great because the little streets that connect the houses and stuff, they're pretty much the same everywhere, right? But of course, when you want to show the system to somebody, you pick someplace all the way across town, and the car immediately gets on the highway. Well, the highway is the thing in Austin that's weird, right?
It is.
So in Austin, whenever you show somebody the system, it always fails, right? Because it tries to take the highway, and the on-ramp doesn't work. The on-ramps and the off-ramps for the highways in Austin are very weird. So the system is just not very good at them, and you always get to see the system fail. But in California, you don't get that at all. People.
And do you need like localized people to label the different roads, right? So you have different teams? No, you don't have to do it. So
you don't have to do that.
Oh wow. So how does it learn over time that in Austin there are different rules and different roads?
So right now, remember it's a moving target. So I'm giving you answers that are a little bit complicated because sometimes I'm answering your question for today. And sometimes I'm answering your question for like 5 years from now, or like where will it eventually go? Right. Today, the almost all the planning is human written code. And so the human written code, I mentioned before that it'll have thresholds in it, like, if the neural network says this probability, do you stop or go, or do you turn or not turn, or whatever? And so they have all these numbers that are parameterized in the code, and they can tune those numbers. You can change those numbers to change the behavior of the system significantly. So even though the high-level code, the planning code, is mostly handwritten, because it has a lot of parameters in it, its behavior can be tuned to different cities. And tuning is a pretty straightforward and fairly automated process in the sense that people drive it, you see where they break and where they intervene, and then you adjust the numbers a little to make it less likely. And so you can tune today to different cities if you want to. I don't think they will, for the most part, because there will be a certain amount of that going on. So it's possible. But what's going to happen is a neural network, they're going to move that part into a neural network. And then when they collect the training data for the cards to train the neural network, they know where it comes from. Like every training piece is like, it was at this street, it was in this town, or whatever. So if you want to make the car better in, say, San Francisco and not as good in LA, what you do is when you train it, you put a little bit more San Francisco data in and a little bit less Los Angeles data in, and then it'll just tend to work better in San Francisco because it will, when in doubt, it'll use the San Francisco interpretation, or it'll be more likely to do that. And so the experience of the driver is that it'll work better in San Francisco. So that's a way that you can tune a system. So like if you have a bunch of data for Singapore and you have a bunch of data for the United States, right? They do gather data from all over the world and that they feed into the system right now when they do the training. But a system that they release in the United States, it'll have, relatively speaking, if you look at the whole training set, because they've got much more data than they can train with, so they can pick and choose. they can bias it towards US data. Now, having a certain amount of Singapore data in there is good, even for the US, and having a certain amount of Australia, because it expands the sort of the space of understanding of what's a street, right? What's a neighborhood. Like you want these outliers in your data set. You want them to be real world, but you want them to be outliers because they encourage the network to be more general in its interpretation of the situation. So a good example is like roundabouts. They're used universally in Europe and very little in the United States. But having extra roundabouts in the US data actually is better for the car than having very, very few roundabouts in the data, because it's a perverse interconnect structure that causes the neural network to be more so. But the version for Singapore, on balance, will probably have significantly more Singapore data in it than US data. So, and that can be just automatic. They can, the system can basically, the training system can pick and choose from the total corpus of data that's available everywhere to decide that it wants to bias. And they can run it. First of all, they can push the system out in Singapore and watch how people use it and see how well it's working. And then they can adjust those numbers to make it work better, because every week, every 2 weeks, they can just push another version out. Another thing they can do is they can run in simulation. They can have a Singapore version of the simulator and a US version of the simulator. So when they first build it, they build it and they put, 90% America, 10% Singapore in, and they see how that works. And if that doesn't work very well, maybe you do 12% Singapore and 88% America, or whatever the deal is. So they can adjust that before they send the system out. And those are all, they're mostly automatic. They don't require a human being to do a lot of labeling, but they'll be supervised by a human for the most part, right? Like some human being will look at the results and say, oh yeah, that's good enough. We can sell it. We can send that. Right?
And all this data is high chance they are going to be saved in the vehicle, or like how would it work? Like, let's say if your car is
the car doesn't know that. So a clip of data that gets captured by your car, it goes up to the training center and gets used to train neural networks, but it never leaves the training center. The neural network, when you train the neural network, it learns from that data, but it doesn't have a recording of it. It just has a generalization of it. So in the same way, you don't remember all the roads you've ever driven on, even though they influence the way that you drive. So the neural network, it doesn't remember all the examples it saw, but those examples will influence what it is. And it's just the neural network that gets sent out to the individual cars. So they have kind of the skill that the neural network acquired, but they don't have the whole training database. And it couldn't, because the training database is vastly larger than any. And the cars don't have that much memory in them, actually. They're pretty small.
So what actually does go into the car? So for example, right, if you drive in from Austin to LA, like in the future, would the car behave differently?
Probably. Well, in the long run. So right now, the car doesn't behave differently at all, because they don't make a different version for Massachusetts from California. They just have one US version. They have a different Canada version. Now, the roads in Canada are pretty much the same, but the rules are a little bit different. So they have a different version of the software that goes to Canada. And then I understand that Europe is different, and Japan is different. This is Autopilot I'm talking about. Most of these places don't have FSD right now. But if they do the same thing with FSD that they do with that they have been doing with Autopilot, they'll probably have different versions for widely different locales. But in the United States, a single version has to deal with rural Minnesota and downtown Dallas. There's just a single version that does it. So you don't really see a difference in the behavior, but the behavior is not that great right now. It's not like the car isn't so amazingly good that it makes a difference whether it's in San Francisco or things it doesn't see very often, it messes up on more. But so the failures are distinct in different towns. Like the things that tend to mess up in San Francisco are different from the things that tend to mess up in Los Angeles, but they don't try to fix that right now. And in the long run, they won't have a different version, because a single version is likely to be much more generally capable. There might be an intermediate time, say 3, 4, 5 years from now, where there's an advantage for tuning for different cities, and the economics of doing it makes sense. Like they have enough cars, so there might be a time when they do that, but they're not doing it now. And in the long run, it won't be necessary.
Okay, so what happens when a Canadian Tesla drives into the States, and both of them have, like, the Canadian vehicles FSD Beta? Can they use it? And
that's a good question. I mean, right now it'll work.
Okay.
The biggest difference, it'll probably make some mistakes that it wouldn't have made in Canada, is probably the simple answer. I mean, the biggest difference is that the Canadian regulators, they required Tesla to put certain limitations into the system that the US cars don't have. So if you have a US car and you drive to Canada, it'll work.
Okay.
But it won't follow the rules that the regulators want. It won't follow all the rules. There's a couple of rules it won't obey. And that'll change, right? Because probably what Tesla will do is, in a month, they'll make a single version for Canada. Or they can put both versions in the car. And if you cross the border, it switches to the other one. They can do that too. Because the software, the neural network's not so big that you can't have multiple versions in the car. But you can only, it really only has the computational capability to run one at a time.
Okay. Interesting. So how does the vehicle actually recognize behaviors on the road? So let's say you have a pedestrian that is potentially going to cross the road, and so you mentioned probabilities, right? So for example, if someone's walking towards the junction, and then how does the vehicle decide that, okay, this person is going to stop or not going to stop? Or for example, if you're trying to do a lane change and someone's slowing down for you, how does the vehicle understand that someone else has given way to you? And then when does it make that decision to change the lane? Like, what's going through the vehicle's mind? Is it the same as what we would think as we drive, or is it a bit different?
So today, a lot of the planning stuff is their handwritten rules that human beings use.
Okay.
So it can vary quite a bit. The simple answer is generally it's ballistics. Most of the time, it's just if they keep going and I keep going, will we encounter each other? And if you won't, like, if the cyclist is slowing down and the extrapolation is that they'll stop and there will be lots of space and there's high confidence, then the car won't stop. But if there's uncertainty and there's some possibility you might interact, then it will. And it's the same thing with like the merging. If your car wants to merge to the right and there's a space big enough for your car, and that space is staying the same or getting bigger, the car will go. And if it's getting smaller, it won't go. Right. So it's mostly today, it's pretty simple extrapolation of what cars are already doing. And you see this quite a bit, like just do in the freeway merge kind of thing. It's the car wants to change lanes to the left. So, but there's a car coming, but it's not coming too fast. If the car's coming really fast, the car won't signal.
Sure.
But there's a car kind of coming up slowly, and the car turns on its turn signal, right? So as long as that car is still closing the gap, your car won't make the lane change. But if that car stops, so the gap stops getting smaller, then it'll move over, right? Even if the car's quite close, it'll move. It'll pull pretty much straight in front of another car, as long as the gap isn't getting smaller. So it's mostly very simple stuff like that.
Okay. And right now, right? So let's say when we're performing a lane change, sometimes you realize that there's a lag, right? It takes some time for the vehicle to decide whether or not it's okay to pull to the left lane, for example. Is it because of a hardware issue that is not fast enough, or is it because that the car is kind of making sure there is high enough confidence to do the lane change? Is the lag time because we're not processing data fast enough, or is it?
It's the lag time for the hardware is pretty imperceptible for an individual frame update. Now, there are things where I mentioned before that there is kind of the neural network. The way that it works right now is it actually looks at what has happened for the last 50 or 100 meters and what has happened for the last few seconds. It remembers those things.
Sure.
If there was a really important event in that stack somewhere, it's possible that as long as that until that event exits the stack, which might take a few seconds, the car won't move.
Sure.
So for instance, imagine that that a car that you wanted to do a lane change, but then as it started doing the lane change, it saw a car coming really fast. So what the car does right now is it aborts. It'll abort the lane change. Now, but say the car stops. Now you could go back over, right?
Yeah.
But it's possible that the memory of that, how fast that car was moving before, that it won't wait, that until that memory exits the stack, it won't reevaluate the decision, right? In other words, the fact that that car was coming really quickly at a recent point in time, if it's an important enough factor in a decision, it could be that creates a latency. Now, that's not a hardware limitation. There's a built-in kind of time frame that it remembers things. And until it forgets that, it might not move. So there will be a very small number of things where that will occur, where it saw something. Like, imagine, I mentioned before that it's very careful about pedestrians. It used to be kind of ridiculously careful, where like if there were pedestrians on the street, like it would stay behind them as they were walking down the road, or it would drive 10 feet around them. You know, it was really, really careful around pedestrians. And as the software has matured and as Tesla has become more confident that the car is safe around pedestrians, they've allowed it to get a little bit closer. So now you get a thing where, you know, you're going down the road and there's a cyclist in your lane, and he's a little bit to the right. Well, the car wants to be able to move over 3 or 4 feet, which means it has to exit its lane. Now, it used to be, once upon a time, that it would have to do a lane change, you know, to the other lane, and then drive past the cyclist, and then it could go back. And now they'll move over a few feet just to pass the cyclist, and then go right back into the lane. But the fact that there was a pedestrian is still a very important thing. So the thing you were talking about that you saw when you were riding with Deborah, where a cyclist was coming to the intersection and they stopped really abruptly, right? Yeah. Well, the car might have been remembering, well, he was moving really fast a minute ago, and that's really important, right? That's so important that I'm going to stop until it's really clear that he's totally stopped. Whereas if the cyclist was coming more slowly, it might not have waited that long for the buffer to flush before it was willing to proceed. But once again, that's not a hardware processing speed limitation. So they do have processing speed limitations, but the processing speed limitation is basically how big a neural network can you run in real time, right? So they can only do so much processing in a 36th of a second. And the neural network is only allowed. Now, neural networks are completely deterministic. Every time you run them, they take exactly the same amount of time. So they can build a neural network so that it runs in 1/37th of a second, and it's fine, and they can just run that. But but they can only process as much as they can as the neural network can handle in that window of time. That's the limitation.
Okay, and so in an example where we had a cyclist that's coming in, right? What happens if the vehicle see what's behind them? So if I'm going to jam, like if the vehicle hit the brakes, right, there's a chance that the vehicle behind is going to maybe bump to you or not stop in time. So how does it, in situations like this, how would they decide what to do? Like, do I stop for the pedestrian?
Well, it's no contest. If there's a pedestrian in front of you and a car behind you, the car's going to stop. Because the car would rather get rear-ended than hit the pedestrian. Right? So that's very clear in that situation. A better question is, like, what if a car in front of you suddenly stops? Right? So the choice is, do you hit the car in front, or do you let the car behind you hit? And in that situation, the car is much better than people are at judging stopping distance and stopping speed. So, for a human being, if the car in front of you hits the brakes and you hit the brakes, like if it's a panic stop, humans aren't really good at judging, like, am I stopping just fast enough or too fast or not fast enough? They just stomp on the brakes and they hope for the best, right? And so that's why a lot of times you get rear-ended, because there's 30 feet in front of you and no space behind you, because you stopped too fast. So FSD does have the advantage that it's going to be a lot better at judging how fast it has to stop to just leave 2 feet in front of the car.
Okay.
But there are going to be those situations where you have to accept getting hit, and you would rather be hit from behind than hit somebody else from behind. So so there are situations like that where the car can make a better decision than a human. There are situations where, you know, you're just going to accept the accident because you're not going to risk the pedestrian. It's vehicle versus pedestrian accidents are extremely deadly.
Okay.
So the rules that the car abides by is it is more careful around pedestrians than anything else. That's the most important thing that it does, because it doesn't want to hit a pedestrian no matter what. So it kind of overreacts at this point, and it's probably going to keep doing that for a long time. And frankly, that's the right thing to do. Okay. Because, you know, if you have to fix your bumper, that's one thing, but if you send somebody to the hospital, that's really terrible.
Sure. Okay. And I'm not sure whether you recently you saw Green on Twitter recently posted a few accidents on Autopilot, right? So
I've seen so many.
So what happened was the vehicle was straight up. It's at night, right? And the vehicle, you have a lane obstruction straight up ahead and no warning lights, not whatsoever. And the Autopilot just drove straight into the vehicle. Do you see those?
Okay, if you're talking about the one that he posted just a week or two ago, that actually wasn't on Autopilot. Like, he didn't know if it was on Autopilot when he first posted it, and then later he decided it wasn't on Autopilot. At least I talked to him about it, and that was what he told me. Sure. So we might not be talking about the same one. Certainly, it is certainly, you know, possible to have circumstances that Autopilot can't avoid the accident. Those things will happen. Okay. I can't, off the top of my head, to the best of my knowledge, there have been no accidents on FSD. Okay. There have been accidents on Autopilot. Yeah. Recent accidents on Autopilot, to the best of my knowledge, have been pretty minor accidents. Okay. But if you've got an example you want to discuss specifically, like, we could pause and you could send it to me and we could talk about it.
Yeah. So I'll just send it to you because I thought that was interesting. So they had the Autopilot logo on, but then I think it was disengaged right towards the end, like 3 seconds before it hit the car. Yeah. So this was posted about 2 weeks ago. Are we on the same one? I sent it to you on Skype.
Let me. Now I don't know how to do this. Let me see if I can.
Or do you want me to send you?
Oh yeah, if you send it there, that's good.
I sent it to you on Twitter.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So he hadn't annotated this before. Yeah, this is the one I was thinking of. Okay. So what's happening here? The car is in Autopilot. Uh-huh. Let me see if I get the timing right. It does the lane change. Yeah. Okay. So there's a bit before this also, which isn't included in this clip. Okay. So if you see the entire clip, what you'll see is that the Autopilot car is overtaking a car in the right lane so that it can move to the right because there's an exit coming up, I presume, right? Yep. So, and this is also why the driver has a problem, incidentally. Sure. So the Autopilot car, it's needing to make its lane change. As soon as it passes the car on the right, it initiates a lane change to move into that lane. The driver sees the obstacle ahead and disengages Autopilot and tries to change lanes out. So if Autopilot had stayed engaged, Autopilot probably would have slammed on the brakes and not tried to do the evasive maneuver. Interesting. Like, Autopilot won't try an evasive maneuver in this situation. It will just brake if it sees an obstacle like that. So that was one of the reasons. Actually, when Green first sent me the clip, I looked at it, and because he asked me if I thought it was in Autopilot, and I went through the clip a bunch of times to analyze it, and I decided that it couldn't have been in Autopilot during the collision because Autopilot won't do an evasive maneuver to avoid a collision. It'll only brake. That's the only action it will take. Okay. And the driver didn't slow. He tried to maneuver out of the way, right? Yeah. If Autopilot had braked, there might have been about a better outcome if he hadn't. But
Okay.
The driver turned the steering wheel to disengage autopilot and tried to avoid without braking too much. So now one of the reasons that the driver was surprised, right, of course, is because during the passing maneuver, when his car is passing the other car, he's checking the blind spot to make sure there's space when it does over. So when he turns and looks ahead, he suddenly sees this obstacle.
Yeah.
So, and of course, you can't see the obstacle very well. So it's not a very good situation.
Okay. This is interesting. Yeah.
There's a good chance autopilot would have had an accident in any case. As a human looking at the video, you can tell that you can't see there's an obstacle until it's almost too late.
Yeah. Yeah. And I thought it's something quite interesting, right? It's very human when we are driving, and if something is up front in front of you, you're going to take over, right? And so the question here is like, do you let autopilot do the driving, or do you take over?
Yeah, it's a good question right now. I think this situation where people disengage autopilot and then have an accident, it's not all that rare, actually. Yeah. And in fact, Tesla, in the statistics that Tesla publishes, if an accident occurs within 5 seconds of autopilot disengagement, they count that as an autopilot accident. So this would count, Tesla will count this as an autopilot accident, this event, because it's close enough together, because that happens a lot, where people disengage. Yeah, I don't know. This is a tough one. I mean, I think the right thing for the driver, in hindsight, is a very difficult judgment to make in the heat of the moment. In hindsight, if the driver had slammed on the brakes as hard as he could, as soon as he saw, he probably would have had a better outcome.
Right.
But that is to say, he still would have had an accident. It would have been less velocity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Boy, that's really terrible.
Yeah,
I'm watching it over and over on a loop on this monitor.
Yeah, so there's actually a few of them, right? If you scroll down further on Green's channel, you have a few where you have like obstructions dead ahead out of nowhere, and then you have no warning, and you almost see like almost a 90% chance where usually the driver actually takes over, right, to try to stop the car.
Of course. So it's a mistake to rely on autopilot to save you these days, and all drivers know this. I mean, nobody trusts autopilot in a pinch, and it's the right thing to do because it's still it's under development, and I mean, the right thing to do is to brake as hard as you can in that situation and hope for the best, because you've just been put in a really terrible situation and there's no good solution.
Yeah.
And so an interesting thing looking at this, right, is that you could say, well, what if it had other sensors that can see better, right? Autopilot can actually see a lot better than this video shows. The reason is because the cameras are HDR cameras, but this dash cam video, it's not saved in HDR. It's saved in regular definition. So autopilot is actually pretty good at seeing in the dark. It's not really great at recognizing weird stuff very far away, because they only have so many labeled accidents.
Yes.
So that's still a weakness.
Yeah.
I would expect that in time, the cameras that the car has and autopilot will get good enough that it would see this and avoid this accident. It's clearly not doing that now. And I don't know when it will get there. I'm quite confident it will eventually get there.
Yeah.
There's also the radar question, right? Like, what if you had radar in this situation, right? And unfortunately, at least if you have the radar in the cars today, it actually makes the situation worse in a very perverse way, which is that the radars that the cars have right now are Doppler radars. So they can't see non-moving objects very well at all. They're very terrible at zero velocity objects. So that's why, there's been a number of these events where autopilot hits a truck at the side of the road. I mean, classically, it's a fire engine or a police car or something like that. Some vehicle that's pulled off the road, but not all the way off the road. It's kind of, and so in that situation, that you've got this, the vision system and the radar disagree about what they're seeing. The vision system is looking at like the fire engine, and it's kind of an unusual vehicle, and it's in an unusual pose. And it's mostly off the road, right? So the vision looks at the fire truck and says, it's a fire truck, it's off the road, but it looks like it might be, I don't know, I'm not sure. I'm like 50% sure it's a fire truck or whatever. But the radar system, it can't see non-moving objects. So the radar says there's nothing there, right?
Yeah.
So that actually dilutes the vision system's confidence, right? Because the radar is telling it the opposite of what it wants to, of what it should hear.
Yeah. So that's the thing, right? So I really think the cameras can see a lot, right? Like for us, if you watch the video, it appears like you can't see the vehicle at all. But so I've actually tried, like in really heavy downpours, right? Like if you don't turn on your wipers and we can't see anything on the road, Autopilot is just fine. So the question was, is it because Autopilot cannot recognize the object that is on the floor? So if you don't have so much things to train with, right? For example, you don't have so many things like vehicles turn over or trucks that are on its side, or even if you have a motorbike that's on the floor. Like how does it recognize these objects? So in the case, let's say we swap out the vehicles with a motorbike that is on the ground, right? Clearly Autopilot would see the motorbike, but like, does it know what to do with the motorbike? Like, does it know it's a...
Well, so there are situations that you can, so the Autopilot team, they can anticipate the motorcycle down situation. Like that's kind of an obvious one. And so you can bet that they went out and gathered, you can set the situation up and take the pictures for one thing, so that you can build your own training data manually. And you can do this in simulation also. You can simulate all different kinds of motorcycles falling down photorealistically. They have a photorealistic simulator, and that's not as good as seeing real motorcycles down, but it is helpful. It is helpful, right? So there are things that you can do, and if it's a situation that's easily anticipated, then you can do that. But what if it's half of a refrigerator, that's been part of an accident, or like the hood of a car, like two cars got into an accident and there's some weird car part laying in your lane, right? There are going to be things that, there's different ways a neural network has of detecting stuff that's going on. One is to recognize the object. And so that's the one we know the most about and that we train specifically for. But there are lots of things that are obstacles that you've never seen before. A pile of dirt in the road, like every pile of dirt is different, right? So another thing that you can look for is just anything that's a material obstacle. You can look to map the surface and try to look for solid surfaces. So that's another thing you do. And then the other thing that you can do, and this is what humans do, and in the long run, this is what happens, is you see something that's weird and upsetting, and then you look at it really closely, right? And so in the long run, what neural networks will do, so right now, the way the Tesla system is working, so what humans do, the way the human brain works in this situation is as you're driving down the road, your brain is predicting what you're going to see next constantly, right? Next will look like that. And the thing is, and when your eye sees something that's a little bit different, it catches your attention, and then you re-examine that, right? That predictive nature gives you a time advantage. In fact, if we didn't do this, human beings couldn't drive cars because our reflexes are too slow. Your brain has to constantly be priming you to act quickly by predicting this is what you should see. And if you don't see this, stop, right? So you can be hair trigger all the time. You can have very fast reflexes, even in complicated situations, because your brain is very good at predicting all the reasonable possibilities. And if it sees something else, it knows something weird is happening. So neural networks aren't doing that yet. They will eventually do that. I'm pretty confident, because it's such a powerful technique for doing stuff. And we see that used in other places. I was talking about how neural networks that the big language models, BERT and GPT-3, the super high performance language models, they all do that trick. They try to predict what it should see, and then they pay attention when they're not seeing what they should. So we don't do that with vision models yet, because it's hard to do with vision models, but we will eventually do that with vision models. And when we do that, the systems will get a lot better in these situations.
Okay. And is this also the reason why, in the drive we did with Deborah, when it did a left turn or when it does a right turn, sometimes it would turn into the wrong lane?
Yeah, it does.
Is it because it's not predicting, or like
Yeah,
why
so
does that happen?
so right now the lane thing, especially in cities, is kind of complicated. Once again, it's a combination of so it used to be, and this is just one or two versions back, that the map that the car has for driving downtown, it has in it some information about the lanes. So if you're coming to an intersection and you have to be in the right lane to turn, like the maps have mistakes, but usually the map will say you have to get in the right lane. And so before you get to the intersection, there will be the planning code that's written by people will say, oh, there's a right turn coming up, try to get in the right lane, right? It turns out there are all kinds of situations where you get messed up if you write that code and you tell, and the map overrides what the car sees. And this is what used to happen a lot. The car would pull into the right lane, even though there's an obstacle there. Like there's a trash can in the lane, and you pulled into the lane and it's right before the intersection. And so the car would do this, what seems to a human, a really stupid thing. Or maybe there's a bus stopped, or, there's a mail truck. It's just stopped there. Or there are people standing in the road. It pulls into the lane because the code told it to, right?
Okay.
So on the latest version, they changed this. So the neural network can look at that situation because it's already looking at the situation and looking at where the free space is that's drivable. And if it sees a trash can or a mail truck or pedestrians, it will pick a route around them. It won't do that. Okay. So recently what they did is they started letting the neural network have priority on those lane decisions, right? So the neural network, so it looks at the scene and it's like, what's the right lane to be in? I want to turn right, and here's the scene. What's the right lane? So when you drive the car, there's this thing that people call the worm, or the blue line that comes out of the car, and it moves around like that. Okay, that's a display that shows you what the neural network thinks just looking at the situation. Where's the best place to go? So the neural network is constantly picking something. Then the planning code, it takes what that neural network is and it takes the map data and it makes a decision. So it used to be, it just took the map data and it ignored the neural network when you were coming. And that created a set of problems. So recently they gave the neural network a lot more priority. So if the neural network thought there was an obstacle, or it wasn't a free flow, or a lot of times the neural network looks at a scene and it can see the markings on the road. And it can see, oh, I can turn right from this lane or that lane. And so now it has priority. Even if the map says you can't do it, if it sees the marking on the road now, because it has priority, it can do that turn. So that was useful. It fixed a lot of problems where either the map can't anticipate weird things on the road. It assumes the road is empty. And so they had a lot of errors that occurred in that. So, but now they've gone a little too far the other way.
Okay.
Like, they need to find a better kind of midpoint between what the map says, and because the thing about the neural network, especially in dense cities, is if you look at that line and you're downtown and there's lots of cars and stuff going on, it moves around all the time, right? It's like left, right, no, right lane, left, right, because there are lots of situations where it's kind of on the boundary, like 49% this lane, 51% that one, and then the probability flips 49, 51, and so then it moves back and forth. So as you're driving down the road, in some situations it jumps around a lot, and right now, because they're giving the neural network priority, the car will do this when the line is moving, right? So anyway, it'll get over this. Like they'll fix it in the next version. But like a lot of people have observed this thing where there are situations that it used to just always get wrong that it's doing much better at, but now it has this weird behavior where it jumps around too much, and they need to figure out how to smooth that while still letting the neural network have some influence, because just relying on the map was creating a lot of problems.
So what happens when you're on a straight only lane, but you have to turn right, and on the right lane you have construction works going on and you want to turn right, but you're on a straight only lane? So would the car actually execute that lane change?
Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, is the answer. Like I know this from experience because I've encountered this myself a couple of times. There are times when it'll roll through the intersection straight and it'll reroute and go around. So that often happens. And it's also the case, and you can find lots of YouTube videos of people, like, for instance, you come to an intersection, you want to turn right, and you're supposed to turn into the right lane, but there's construction cones. and it has to go around.
Yeah.
So so in that situation, it almost always does the turn, and it almost always goes around the construction cones, because and this is kind of because the way the decisions are kind of sequential in the planning system right now. If it does a decision and then immediately decides that it wasn't a good decision, it never reverses the previous decision. So if it decides to change lanes, it'll wait until it can change lanes.
Okay.
If the conditions change and it can't change lanes, it's not very good at reversing the decision of making a lane change. So whether it does the turn or not, right now just because of the characteristics of the way they're making decisions is that if it gets to a point where it still feels like it can make the lane change, it'll do it. And if it moves just a little bit beyond that point, and it hasn't concluded it can turn. Like, for instance, if it has to enter the intersection before it can tell for sure it can turn, it won't do the turn.
Sure.
Right? Because now it's too late, according to the rule of the planning software. Yeah. But if it's approaching the intersection and it can see a path that works for it, even though there's an obstacle, it'll do it. Mm-hmm. So it's complicated. It frequently depends on lots of things, like what other cars are approaching the intersection, are there pedestrians present, what's the signage look like. So every situation is a little bit different. But I've seen it work and I've seen it fail. Both.
Yeah. So even in the drive, we have a situation where up front you have construction works. Like you're at a traffic junction, and then you have construction works up ahead, and you have to drive into the anti-direction lane because they have cordoned off the lane for you to drive, and the car would it stopped. It just didn't know what to do, right? And it just stopped there.
Yeah, that happens sometimes. Yeah. I mean, I've seen it work in that situation too.
Yeah.
It's Austin, it really has a lot of, you probably noticed, like everywhere you went, there's construction.
So much construction going on.
Construction. So the car is also, just like the car is weird around pedestrians, it's very weird around construction. Okay. And the reason for that is because people who lay out cones, they're not very consistent, right? It's like that clearly, the traffic rules don't apply. Like they'll tell you to go into the oncoming lane. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there's a person that waves you or not. Yep. Sometimes the lanes aren't big enough. They can be way too narrow. Right. So one of the rules that's written in the software right now is stay away from construction zones. Right. So if you're driving down the road and there are construction cones, it'll change lanes just to get away from the construction cones. It doesn't like construction cones. Okay. It tries to stay away from construction cones. And it tends to only proceed if it sees construction cones and it has to drive through them, it only proceeds if it's very confident that it knows what it can do. Okay. So if it has any uncertainty, because it doesn't want to run into a construction worker.
Sure, right? Of course.
It doesn't want to run into any cones. So it'll just stop. So, and this is an important thing to understand about the current system too, right? The system that's in the cars, FSD right now, it's not a release candidate. Like this is not a first cut at a taxi system. This is test software that they have put out there so that the people can use it and they can learn from how people use it and they can learn in the real world. So that means a couple things. One thing it means is they're not going to take any chances at all, right? Because it's test software and it's early. Right. And when you have humans interacting with it, as we saw in this accident, like there's this gray area of what will the driver do, right? Mm-hmm. Whatever you want to do, you don't want to make things worse for the driver and have that lead to a bad outcome. So there are a lot of situations where the car will just not move forward. And a good example is, so one more point on that is that because there's a driver present, they can afford to be much more timid than they would normally. Because they can rely on the driver to. So I guess if you haven't driven FSD, when you're driving it, if you come to a situation where it is uncertain and it slows down, if you press the gas pedal, it will go. It'll make its best gas and it'll do the steering. And as long as you press the gas pedal, it will keep going. So one thing you can do, this is a very common thing at unprotected left turns, where you have to turn left across fast moving traffic. So you come to the intersection and you stop, and the car wants to turn left, and it's got its turn signal on, right? And you see cars coming, but there's plenty of space. And the car starts moving, but it's not moving fast enough. So you press the gas pedal, and it completes the turn, and everything's fine. Like that's the normal outcome. So why don't they just make the car go fast? And the reason is because if you're wrong, you're turning in front of fast-moving oncoming traffic, right? So because they have a driver in the car and they know that driver's paying attention, the car, see, imagine from the standpoint of the guy who programmed the system, right? Okay, you have two choices. You can tell the car to go slow and ask the human to press the gas if he wants it to go faster, or you can go fast and ask the human to hit the brake if he wants it to go slower. Like those are your choices, right? So the thing is, if you're in the left-hand turn situation and you go fast and they hit the brake, you might stop in front of the cars, right? Like that's bad. So the way the system is designed right now is if the car is even a little bit unconfident, it just proceeds really slowly, and it relies on because you want to give the driver time to evaluate the situation and respond. If you accelerate, the driver doesn't have time to think. If you go slow, the driver can press the brake to stop or press the gas to go. There's plenty of time to decide. Right. So the way the system works right now is when it's uncertain, it slows down and lets the driver decide, should I go or not? And if you want to go, you press the gas and go. Now, a lot of people take to this very naturally. You see, like a lot of drivers are just like, go, 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 and it works fine. Right. But a lot of drivers, they're not comfortable with that. Like if the car is hesitant, they disengage because they want to be comfortable that everything is safe. So some drivers have a lot of disengagements in those situations because they're being careful. And other drivers that are more confident, they press on the gas and then they don't have the disengagement, right? So people's experience with those situations. But the system is designed right now, assuming there's a driver and assuming the driver is paying attention and will take control and is a reliable backup. And because of that, they can be both more timid in certain respects and more adventurous in others. For instance, a very easy way to avoid high-speed left-hand turns is go to where there's a light, right? It's almost always the case that instead of turning left here, you could go up a block or turn a block earlier and do it at a stop sign or a light or something. And so robotaxi systems in the real world, like Waymo and Cruise, they change their route to drive through the safest intersections. They always do their turns at places that are safe because the robot is making the choice. And believe me, when Tesla releases their robotaxi, they will be doing that too, because it's just smart. You want to do the safe turns, right? But right now they're gathering data, right? So what you want to do is you want to do the dangerous turns, right? Because you have a human there to save you if you're wrong. Right. I mean, you don't want to put the human in a bad spot, but you can afford to do turns. You want to try everything. You want to try all the turns and all that kind of stuff. Because if it's no good, the driver will disengage and that kind of stuff. And you learn a lot from those. Those are the hard situations are the ones where you learn the most, where the car gathers the most valuable data about what it's doing. So currently the system kind of has this thing. People who expect it to be a robotaxi are going to be disappointed a lot because it's not designed to do that right now. Instead, you are an unpaid test driver, right? And they make you work for it, right? And most of the time it's great. Like I use it every time I leave the house. If I go get groceries or I run down to the lumber store, and for me, the latest version, I almost never have an intervention. It's like, I want to say the last 10 times I went to the grocery store, it did it fine. And I didn't have to do anything. And that, 2 versions back or, it couldn't do that. It's gotten like to me in the last 2. In fact, there's one problem. Speaking of the lumber store, I've been doing home renovations in my house, so I go to the lumber store a lot. When I come back from the lumber store, there's this left-hand turn underneath an underpass. Okay. And it's a really sharp left-hand turn, and it has a curb right there. Right. So basically you have to turn, and then you have to turn really hard right, and there's 2 lanes that turn at the same time. So it's a very, very hard turn to do. Okay. And the previous version, it could never do it. Like I've driven through that intersection on like 5 or 6 different versions. And the thing is, it would want to drive over the curb, So I'd let it go, and it would get that far, and it would turn out, boop, turn it off, do it myself every time. I love playing with the system, so I let it try every time, and every single time it failed, like 50 times in a row. Just fail. So the latest version, I got 10.12, and it works every time.
Oh wow!
100%, never fails, right? And so that's just one thing. It was a thing that I had to deal with a lot because I keep going to the same lumber store, and it's always the same turn, right? But there are many little things like that where there's this thing, and it seems impossible. Like, why can't it do the simple thing? How stupid is it? Yeah. And then it's fixed one day, and it's never a problem again.
Okay, and why does the steering wheel have really wild turns, as though it's making a decision on the fly and also controlling the turn at the same time?
So that's the neural network. So there are some situations where the neural network is getting priority for deciding which lane to go into. Okay. So imagine you're driving down a long road, and it has 2 lanes going in the same direction, and the traffic is relatively quick. So above a certain speed, if the neural network is moving the wheel back and forth, the control system ignores it because you're moving too fast. You can't adjust you're not allowed to do that. Also, the neural network, the faster you're going, it won't do that. But if you're moving very slow, right, the neural network is like, is this lane blocked? Maybe that lane's blocked, right? Yeah. And then you sometimes you have these situations where it's 50-50, maybe it's this. So the neural network is going dunk, 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 dunk. And if you're not moving very fast, if you're moving really slow, the car just lets the neural network control the steering wheel. So the steering wheel is bopping back and forth. It doesn't happen a lot.
Okay.
That is, if you go out driving around, maybe you'll see that once every 30 minutes or something.
Sure.
It doesn't happen at every intersection. Sure. But there are lots of situations that are kind of 50-50 situations. And because recently they started letting the neural network decide what lane to choose, people see the steering wheel move around a lot more. So that's actually not a difficult thing to fix heuristically by adding a little bit more code to the system. And they'll probably end up doing that. That's why you see it. And in fact, if you look at the display, if you look at the display where the blue line is, when you see the wheel moving back and forth, you'll see it's just following that blue line.
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. So at lower speeds, the neural net has full control of the car, including the steering wheel, which is kind of why.
Well, it's not controlling the steering directly. The thing is, the planning network, if you're moving at low speed, as I said, in previous versions, the planning system would look at what the map said. What lane should I be in?
Sure.
And it would just stay in that lane.
Right.
But then there were lots of situations where that wasn't working very well. So recently they switched over to, at low speeds, let the neural network pick the lane. Because then if a car stops in front of you, it can go around. Or if there's a cyclist in your lane, it will go around. Like things that are hard to anticipate, if you just look at the map data, the neural network can deal with. And if you're moving slow, it's safe to let the neural network move the steering wheel. I mean, if the wheel moves back and forth, what difference does it make, right? Nothing's getting hurt. It might look funny, but it's not. But there's no fault to it. So for now, they're doing that. But it is true that a lot of drivers, they see that and they're like, "Is the car broken? What's going on?" They think it's unnerving. Yeah. So they'll change that behavior. So it's not doing it.
All right, that's cool. So one last one before we end. So actually, this question was something that happened right at the start of the conversation, but I didn't have the chance to ask, right? You mentioned that Tesla is using neural net for perception. Is there a difference? Like, are other self-driving technology doing something differently compared to? Yeah,
it's so the way that so a little bit about the history of robotaxis.
Sure.
Right? Okay, so robotaxi, it's been an idea that people have been really interested in since about 2007 or something. Because around 2007, it became clear that the sensing technology was getting good enough that it would be possible soon. But this is before neural networks. And so there were a number of companies most significantly Google, right? They spent a bunch of money trying to get into the space of developing a robotaxi, right? And the thing is, at the time that they were doing that, there was no decent neural networking technology. All of the control systems were getting written heuristically. So of course, they didn't use neural networks. And one of the things they did was they tried to invest in very powerful sensors that would give you relatively simple to understand outputs, because the computers weren't as fast back then, and they didn't have neural networks. So they needed sensors that would give them a simple understanding of the environment, right? And so they spent a lot of money on sensors, and that was the approach that they used to do this. It turned out that didn't actually work very well. So they had to simplify the problem more. And over the years, what they did is they did a number of things to make the problem simpler. Like, for instance, if you only drive in a certain part of town, right, what you can do is you can precisely measure all the roads very, very accurately, right? So if you measure the roads really accurately, and you have a localization system. So one of the things about LiDAR, and this is a really important aspect of LiDAR, is if you have high definition maps of an area and you have a LiDAR telling you what's in the environment, there's this very simple mathematical operation that you can do where you take the LiDAR data that you're getting right now and you match it against the map, and it tells you exactly where you are to within like 1 centimeter, perfectly accurate, right? Super reliable, and it's not sensitive to obstacles and that kind of stuff. There's a matching algorithm where you can match those two things. So at the time, people were like, we can turn robotaxis into trolleys because they're like on rails, right? You map the city and then you decide, well, here's where the rails are. And the car's just, it knows exactly where it is with the LiDAR as it moves around, and you have this really detailed map. So now it's like controlling a trolley as you move around town, right? Here's where you can turn left, here's where you can turn right. And you break the problem down into as if you're controlling a train. And now you just have to, is there anything in front of me? Stop if I can't move forward because there's an obstacle. It's like controlling a train, right? And so they made progress with that. And, Google in particular, and then other companies that followed on, most notably Cruise today has also, made a lot of progress in this space. They're generally using that approach where they've tried to simplify the problem by operating in a very well-defined geographic area where they understand they've mapped it very, very precisely, and they can use LiDAR, so they have a super precise positioning just using the LiDAR. If you have the LiDAR data for the map and you have a LiDAR data that you're measuring right now, you know exactly where you are on the map very precisely. So that allows them a lot of advantages. They can go through a town and they can decide on every single intersection what you want to do at that intersection in different situations. And that makes it easier to write the code, right? So that's one way of going at the problem of like making a robotaxi that operates inside a certain environment, right? Which is great. I'm super glad those guys are doing it. And, I hope they succeed. I think, it's great that they're doing that. But Tesla's really doing it a different way. Tesla's doing it so that they're kind of making the equivalent of a human being driving the car. Like if you fly to France and you rent a car, and you can, you've never driven in France before, and you go out there and you might not be the best driver on the road, but you're going to get where you're going and you'll probably be safe, right? So Tesla's trying to make that version instead of the one which is super perfect at like a certain set of well understood, well mapped things. They're trying to build this thing that's just completely general. It can go anywhere, can drive on any road. It won't do anything stupid. And so, if it's a dirt road, if there's snow on the road, if it's raining, it'll be able to handle those things in a similar way to where a human being could do it. So and there's different trade-offs within these two approaches. The thing about using LiDAR and high definition maps is that you make the problem easier, and by making the problem easier, you can get to market sooner, right? And that is a really important thing. The reason that, and now when Google started out doing this, their ambition was like Tesla's ambition is today. They wanted to just make a generic thing that could go anywhere and could have just used very simple maps. And they tried it, and it was really hard. And so they tried to simplify the problem. The thing is, those, both Cruise and Google and these other companies, they all started working on the problem before neural networks. And so the thing is, Tesla didn't start until after. In fact, Tesla started on this almost right after the neural network breakthrough in 2012, right? It was like 2014, and Elon Musk is like, hey, this could work.
Yeah.
Right. And so Tesla's not the only company trying to do that. Other companies after the neural network revolution, after the neural network breakthrough, are also trying to do what Tesla does with some different things. I mean, you probably heard of Comma AI. They have the little box that goes in the cart. That's great. There are other companies that are kind of halfway between like what Waymo is doing and what Tesla is doing. They still make a robotaxi. They still have some fancy sensors, but they're very focused on using neural networks to solve the problem. So there are many players doing this stuff. And Tesla is the only car manufacturer that's building their own system and has millions of vehicles. They decided to go really big on the vehicle thing. Yeah. So it's very exciting. I think that, if they succeed, it'll be a great thing. It'll be, the best solution, if you will.
Of course. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think you mentioned you have a 90-minute attention span.
We can keep going. I mean, you can just delete the bad part.
But I mean, maybe one last one, right? Like, do you think Dojo is necessary for us to, like, before Tesla can really roll out FSD? Do you think Dojo is necessary? Like, do you think it has to be up and running?
No. Okay. So Dojo is not bringing a capability. So Tesla has big, NVIDIA A100 based supercluster, right? With 57, 16 nodes or whatever. There isn't any fundamental thing that Dojo can do that their existing cluster can't do. It's just that Dojo should be a lot cheaper. Okay. So as they continue to scale up their neural network operations, they need more and more and more and more computers, and it gets really expensive at some point. I mean, I think I worked out that the current system that they have is a couple $100 million. Sure. That they built, right? And then they built it just a year after they built the previous one, and that one was probably like $100 million. And so if they keep going at this rate, pretty soon they'll be building a new $5 billion supercomputer every year, right? Right. The thing about Dojo is all of these computers that they have right now, like these NVIDIA A100 systems, those systems, they're not designed for neural networks. It's a general purpose compute infrastructure. And because of that, it's not as efficient at neural networks as it would be if it was designed just for doing neural networks, right? So like, just to give a ballpark number, those, you get a certain number of teraflops per chip. Right. And then those big clusters, when you're using those A100s to train, you only get about 5% of that on average. They're only about 5% efficient at delivering their peak rate. So Dojo is re-architected. So it only does neural networks. It's really not good at doing anything else, just neural networks. But it should operate at very high efficiencies, 80%, 90% efficiency. And the interconnect infrastructure, the way that data is passed around, all of the whole thing is tuned to be able to do neural networks really well. So if they get it working and they manage to scale it out and whatnot, it should be 10x cheaper and faster than the end. So if Dojo never works, like, it could be that they build it and it's buggy, or it's too hard to map the software on, or it costs too much money, and they just and they're stuck with the A100s that everybody else has. But what they're hoping, this is kind of like the gigacasting thing, They can build cars without gigacastings, but if they have the gigacastings, it's better, right? Right. So, they worked on it and it worked out, and they're using the gigacastings, and Dojo will be like that, right? It'll be like gigacasting thing, in that it'll give you the same thing, but it'll be cheaper and faster.
Okay. Cool. So Dojo is mainly cost savings, and also will we see a faster rate of progress, or will it be roughly the same?
Yeah, you would. I think the thing about because it's less expensive and because of the way that it's built, it's very easy to scale Dojo. Yeah. So it could be, I mean, one of the things that limits how much progress that they can make right now is how big a data center do they have. So one of the things about, if you try to buy 5,000 of those A100 GPUs, you got to wait like 2 years to get them. Like, the lead time is really long, right? Whereas if Tesla's got their own silicon that's purpose built, they control their own destiny.
Sure.
They should be able to spend less money and scale their compute infrastructure faster. And if they have 10 times as much compute, they can probably move a lot faster.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, one of the problems with buying those giant NVIDIA things right now is they're obsolete in 2 years or 3 years, right? So you only want to spend so much money because 2 or 3 years from now, you're going to want to build a new one because they get so much faster so quickly.
Right. All right. Cool, man. So yeah, I think that's mainly most of the questions that I have for today. It's been super awesome to see you explain and walk through all the different scenarios that the car would have. So yeah, thank you so much again, though. So this will be the end of our conversation with James. Hopefully there'll be more to come. Again, I really want to I cannot thank James enough for him spending the time and also volunteering Deborah to come in to help with this experience. So again, thank you both. I really, really appreciate, and I'm pretty sure whoever that is listening also appreciate all your time and effort put into this. It was super fun, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel.